Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a moment to grab a coffee and refuel a little bit. So we spent the morning talking a lot about the customer. Nikos and Cheryl talked a lot about refocusing their energy and attention toward the consumer as a means of driving the Ninkasi business forward. And then we heard from Justin and Taylor, who gave us a glimpse into the Drizzly consumer and what they're doing to retain their customers as e-commerce becomes a bigger piece of the alcohol business. And now we've got an opportunity to learn more about the next wave of consumers who are entering the alcohol space. They're called Gen Z or Centennial drinkers. And the first Gen Z drinker actually turns 21 on January 1st of this next year. So understanding how that cohort interacts and engages with consumer brands will be critical to the success of all breweries moving forward. They think differently, they shop differently, and they need to be marketed to differently. So with us today are Lindsay Kunkle, the Vice President of Kantar Futures, and Mike Kallenberger, the founder of Tropos Brand Consulting, who will dive deep into the core values of Gen Z drinkers and provide a framework for communicating with this new demographic. Lindsay is actually an expert on all things Millennials and Centennials, and at Kantar, she works with a range of clients to develop future-led strategies, targeting those demographics specifically. And Mike is a longtime beer marketer. He worked for many years with Miller Brewing Company before launching his own consulting firm in 2010. And his primary focus is on the development and the positioning and communication strategies that connect brands to drinker motivations. And he's going to actually help distill some of what Lindsay presents and make it into actionable takeaways for the brewers in the audience today. So without further ado, come on up, Lindsay and Mike. Big round of applause for these guys. Cheers.
So hello, and thank you for having me here today. Thank you, Brewbound. Again, I'm Lindsay Kunkle. I come to you from Kantar Futures, and we're a firm that helps out businesses across all different industries understand consumers better, anticipate changes that are happening in the marketplace, and use that information to shape your business for growth in the future. So that's exactly what I want to do with our time today, this morning, is help you understand a particular type of consumer, and that's this next generation that's coming in, the Centennials. Before we get started, I do just want to make a quick legal note that we are very committed to making sure that we are marketing to legal drinking age adults. Some of the data that you're going to see here today are younger than your current target. That's used for future planning purposes only. So why am I standing up here? Why have I been invited to talk to you? Well, that's because there's a big change that is coming for you. Your consumer that you're marketing towards, that you're trying to engage, is changing. There is a new generation that's coming in. So you might not think, hey, that's not a big deal, right? A 21-year-old turns, when they first get that hit the legal drinking age and they're able to belly up to the bar, what's the difference? Well, there's a big difference. Centennials, this new generation that's coming in, are drastically different than previous generations, different than the current consumer that you have today. They think differently, they make decisions differently, they're shaped by the different experiences they have had, so they have different criteria to analyze brands, and even different taste preferences that you're going to need to understand. So you might have already started to see some of this shift happening with your youngest consumers, those who are 21, maybe to 25, those young millennials. And millennials have long been the kind of darlings of the youth marketplace in their teens and 20-somethings. But in fact, they're really not that young. And that's why, again, we're talking about the Centennials today. When you look at millennials, 43% are homeowners, over half are parents, almost an equal amount earn a household income of $75K or more, and a majority of them are living with a partner. And in fact, the oldest in just 2 years, well, a year and a few months, is going to turn 40. But I want to actually focus on the youngest millennial, because the youngest millennial is just turning 21 this year. And so January 1, a whole new generation of drinkers is going to start to enter your breweries, enter your stores, and we need to understand who they are. We call them Centennials. As was mentioned, there's a lot of different names for this generation. They've gone by Gen Z or the I generation, even post-millennials. We like the name Centennials because they were born at the turn of the century, and also because cent is smaller than mil, and the millennials were born into a world of what was considered endless opportunity, and they were told, you're special, you can do whatever you want. And so there were endless expectations that were placed on that generation. Centennials, as you'll see here, were born into a very different world, a more challenging world. And so the expectations that were placed on them are much smaller. That's not to say who will exceed expectations. It's just saying from the get-go, different expectations were set for millennials versus our centennials. Now, who are these centennials? Well, they're those who are 0 to 20 right now. They are over a quarter of the population. And one of their defining characteristics is how diverse they are. This is an incredibly diverse generation. In fact, by 2019, we expect them to be the first majority-minority generation in the marketplace. And with every single generation, the formative experiences that they go through really shape who they are. It shapes their mindsets, their values, throughout the rest of their lives. And that's no different for centennials. The starting points that they have matter a lot. Starting points matter for generations. And just a few of them up here, they came of age during the recession, hearing talk of financial difficulties at the dinner table, whether it was their family or someone in the community or just on the media in general. They heard about terrorism, both domestically and internationally. There was always connectedness, living these always-on lifestyles. They grew up as mobile natives. They grew in a very diverse country. They grew up during a time of political polarization, a lot of internal strife, and they also had to confront some of the environmental issues that we've been faced as they've witnessed a lot of extreme environmental weather patterns throughout their lifetime. And we see that that's impacting kind of how they engage with the world already. So the political and social unrest that they've witnessed have launched many of them to get very involved in social movements themselves, things like Black Lives Matter. Their mobile-first nature and their facility with different digital technologies has them very comfortable making online payments or payments via an app. It has also made them very aware of some of the security and privacy issues that they face. And so they've gravitated towards platforms like Snapchat, in which the image disappears right after, so it can't haunt them later. And they've also just been marketed with and engaged with much more mature storylines. Thinking of Hunger Games is a great example of that, where children are literally fighting to the death for their survival. That it's these more mature themes that is actually resonating with this generation. And we hear this from multiple sources. Refinery 29 here saying, you know, they're the first generation to really grow up in this sort of connected world, and that gives them the thought that they can really create anything that they want. But you ask some centennials about that, and they'll actually say that put some extra pressure on them and in their lives. And as we tell a lot of our clients, this is a generation that is growing up to be less idealistic and more pragmatic, and as a result, they're becoming more savvy in the way that they plan for their own futures and the way they're going to engage with you. One of the most compelling data points that I think we'll both show you here today is this one up here. And it really, I think, characterizes how these formative experiences have shaped centennials and how they're going to, especially in your category. When we ask, we have been running our survey for a very long time. back since the 70s. But in the year 2000, we asked teenagers who were then millennials, describe your generation. And half of them said, we're about fun. As you might expect a teenager to respond. We asked Centennials that same thing, and only 17% of them agreed with that. So you have a much more serious generation that's coming into the marketplace. It's not that they don't want to have fun, they absolutely do, but it's not how they define themselves. We can see this in some of the media that's marketed towards them. Teen Vogue, kind of one of the big teen Bibles for a lot of youngsters. This one is from April and May of 2003. So again, when millennials were teenagers. You can see here that it features Ashanti, who had just released a new album. She had a fresh look, but she was still lamenting the fact that she couldn't get a date. They were promoting very specific styles of makeup, of jeans to wear. The magazine was also debating whether Avril Lavigne style was in or out. Fast forward to what Centennials are reading today. First off, they're reading it digitally. Teen Vogue is now only issued in digital print, not physical. And you can see here in this cover that it features Willow Smith. And the article on her talks about her passion for sewing and quantum mechanics. The magazine encourages you to find your own unique style, not follow a pre-prescribed one. So while millennials really wanted to keep up with pop culture, we're seeing Centennials engage in much more serious news. And of course, technology, when we talk about this generation, is always top of mind. I've already mentioned it several times here this morning. And it's easy to say, yes, that is the one defining characteristic. That's how we get these guys. We engage them with technology. Well, that might be true in many ways, but as my colleague Andrew Hahn, and our internal tech expert, says, talking about technology to Centennials is like talking to a fish about water. It's something that they expect. It's not something that's going to wow them or really woo them to engage with you even more. It's just what they expect to be out there. So thinking holistically about all these formative experiences and who this generation is, we've come to a set of core values. And these are core values that the Centennial generation will use to make decisions as they go forward. It will be how they analyze different things in their personal lives, as well as how they engage with the marketplace, with your brands, with your products, with your beers. And the first core value is openness, the second is resilience, and the third is realism. And I'll go into a bit more detail with each of these. Starting with openness. Centennials really live by this motto of you do you. They've been around a lot of diversity in their upbringing, and so they're very open to this going forward. And gender fluidity is actually a space where we see this a lot, that they're very open to not necessarily having to conform to specific gender norms. The second core value is resilience, and having grown up in the recession and understanding that the path wasn't necessarily paved right ahead for them, this is a generation that understands the value of hard work. They're going to put all their efforts into something, but they understand that failure might be part of that scenario. In fact, the author of Fostering Grit here talks about, if we teach children these days only success, we're failing them. We need to teach kids to understand the frustrations of failure. And most Centennials really have had that upbringing where they understand if you fall down, you have to really get right back up and shake it off. And lastly, realism is one of their core values. Similar to resilience, they're understanding what limits and constraints are out there, and they're going to figure out a way around that and how to navigate forward. When I had asked them about describing their generation, the second most common response was that they described their generation as living in dangerous times. The only thing that topped that was that high tech was a big part of their lives. And farther down on the list, only 8% agreed that we'll have great opportunities as adults. They understand that there's a lot of competition out there, and they understand that they're coming of age in difficult times. So that's kind of how they expect to be messaged as well. Now, these core values and their formative experiences and their access to everything, so always having information on your brands and what ingredients are used and what your policies as a company are, help them to be more careful and informed consumers. And when we look at our spending data, already they have a propensity towards saving and not spending. We see them saying, you know what, only 4 in 10 say I will spend more than I did last year in the next 12 months. And we see that increasing with age. So as they get closer to your category, they're becoming more minded about saving for their college, saving for their future beyond that as well. And when it comes to brands, this is a generation that has felt a little jilted by brands in the past. They're scrutinizing of them. They don't quite trust what a brand might do. They kind of operate under the assumption that brands are guilty until proven innocent. As you can see here, 2/3 of them say, you know what, if an opportunity arises, a business will take advantage of their consumer base. But I don't want to give you an impression that these are, this is a generation that isn't brand loyal, that they're not going to engage in brands, because we absolutely see them devoted to brands. In fact, we see them placing a lot of responsibility on brands, saying brands play an important role in society. They expect brands to participate in the community and to be upstanding corporate citizens. And they place a lot of this pressure on themselves as well. They will let you know that they really believe that they're empowered to create change, that either as groups or individuals, that they can really make a difference. And this has been showcased to them in shows like Netflix's hit Stranger Things, where there's really no one hero, one great guy that saves the day. It's many different people that can be it. And so the same goes. They feel that many people, many different entities or groups or organizations, brands can help to create positive change. And I keep saying the word change, so I'm going to put it up on the screen right here, because change is the one constant of Centennials' lives. They have always seen a world that's kind of a bit volatile and being uprooted. And they have come accustomed to it. They've come to actually demand change. They're looking and seeking disruption. But that disruption that they're looking for, they want to have a purpose. This is a generation that's very community-minded, and they want to put ahead what's best for the community, for the planet, for the environment, ahead of any other priorities. And they're willing to take risks when they see the payoffs in these sorts of changes, in disruption themselves. And so they have the same expectations that they then project onto brands and businesses. So I'm about to hand the mic over to Mike, but before I do so, kind of 2 things to think about here as you hear what he has to say and consider this new generation that's coming into your business starting in January. Reflect their values. Be open. Be resilient. Be realistic with them. And help create this world that they want. They do want positive change. They want disruption. They want new experiences. So how can you deliver on that for them? How can you actually use them as they come into the category to help reinvent that experience that they want to have with you? So happy to take questions after, but I will go ahead and hand it over to Mike, who will continue to talk about our Centennials.
Let's jump right in here, because the future of beer is in Centennial hands. The same disclaimer that Lindsay put up. We want to make it clear that we're not talking about marketing to current underage drinkers. This is about planning for the future. So first, why generations matter. You didn't come here for a history lesson, so I'm going to buzz through this quickly, but understand a little bit more about how we're going to interpret this generation. Here's a brief history of beer brands engaging with different generations. And I found this framework here to be incredibly useful for understanding how brands resonate with different consumers. And you might recognize it's based on Maslow's needs hierarchy, but I have found that you can classify almost any person based on a core motivation that they experience in life that fits into one of these 4 broad territories, and that powerful brands offer a consistent emotional promise that addresses one of those 4 territories. So the 4 are: provide structure, connect with others, leave a mark, fulfill your potential. In the 1970s, baby boomers really flocked to Miller High Life because of the Miller Time campaign at the time. This was a campaign that was all about positioning the brand as the best reward for a hard day's work. It really spoke to baby boomers' desire to leave a mark on the world. There was definitely a skew among baby boomers toward this motivation. And what you might not realize is this was not particularly a blue-collar brand, even though the imagery was very blue-collar. Less than half the loyal drinkers of Miller High Life were blue-collar workers, because it was speaking to everyone's desire for that sense of reward and leaving a mark. In the 80s, the first wave Gen Xers were drawn by this Buds for You, which is arguably the greatest and most effective beer campaign of all time. This Buds for You took that hard-working message and repositioned it as about connecting with others rather than leaving a mark. And first wave Gen Xers were much more drawn to this motivation, connecting with others. And so the conventional wisdom is that Budweiser stole High Life strategy and executed it better. But part of what they did was take it from a leaving a mark motivation to connecting with others. In the 90s, second wave Gen Xers were drawn heavily to import brands. Imports are, to one extent or another, are about status. Status actually fits in the provide structure territory. That's surprising to some people, but that's where it fits. And that's what was motivating second wave Gen Xers. In the 2000s, first wave Millennials really brought a renaissance to craft beer. Craft beer had been in the doldrums for much of the 90s. I believe that part of the reason that happened, a big part of the reason that happened, is because some of the craft brands that emerged in the 90s brought this irreverence. They brought a collective personality to craft beer that was much more creative, playful, and rebellious. This was very powerful for Millennials, and it spoke to a motivation to fulfill your potential. And then in the 2010s, the most interesting man in the world spoke to second wave Millennials with more of a leave a mark motivation. So with this as context, I believe, this is obviously speculative, but it's informed speculation, connecting with others is going to be the core motivation for adult Centennials when they're looking for brands to engage with. What's going to pull them in that direction? Well, Gen Xer parents shifted the focus. They were far less interested in creating super achievers or achievement-oriented kids as they were about safety. Lindsay spoke to how the world was seen as more dangerous when Centennials were growing up. That's going to push them more towards a safety orientation. Basically, to Gen Xers, super parenting is a baby boomer invention. Mothers are really saying they've had it with these standards of perfection. These are all articles that came out a few years ago when this generation was emerging. Gen Xer parents did emphasize safety and control. Gen Xer parents Centennials tended to have Gen Xer parents, at least to this point. Millennials had boomer parents. Gen Xer parents had more strict rules for their kids because they were looking to keep them safe. Social intelligence has actually been emerging as a parenting value recently, and David Brooks is not the greatest expert on this, but I chose this example because it's the most vivid illustration of the transition. I don't know if you've heard of Amy Chua. She's an Asian American woman who wrote a book called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, where she's explaining why they raise superior kids in her culture. And it really describes this sort of grueling set of standards that she had for her own kids. It was just discipline off the charts. Well, what's interesting is both Amy Chua and David Brooks were born on the Xer boomer transition. And where Amy Chua seems to be emphasizing the residual boomer attitude taken to an extreme, David Brooks had a piece in the New York Times called Amy Chua's a Wimp. Because as he's pointing out, the social intelligence required for things like a sleepover are more arduous skills and more productive skills in life than any sets of academic achievement skills. So there was a shift going on between, again, wanting my kids to be achievers versus wanting my kids to be safe and wanting my kids to have social intelligence. This, too, fits with connecting with others as a motivation. It also might be an antidote to too much screen time. I think an awful lot of people think that these kids today do have too much screen time. A survey from Pew Research showed that almost half of all parents said, my kids spend too much time looking at screens. Centennials have grown up with third places. I think most of you probably know the concept of the third place. It's neither work nor home, but a third place where people get together to connect with others. In a Piper Jaffray survey that they do every year, Starbucks is the favorite restaurant of Centennials in 12 of the last 14 years. And Starbucks is really all about that third place attitude. So this, too, I think, is pushing them toward connecting with others. And then Lindsay has taken great pains to point out to me that she had the data on how they don't say they're about fun nearly as much as millennials did. And she's taken great pains to point out they're not saying they want more fun in their lives either. I think that could definitely change as adults. There are some fairly interesting parallels between this generation and the silent generation of the 50s. And that was a generation that grew up saying they weren't about fun either. And as adults, they became very much fun-oriented as a reaction to how reserved they'd been as teenagers. So that could happen with this generation too, and that too pushes them toward connecting with others. So what are the implications of all this? If I'm right, if connecting with others is going to be the core motivation for millennials as a generation, well, it could say that beer will be on the comeback trail. Chris said the numbers this morning about how beer overall sales are still not doing that well. Historically, mainstream beer has skewed heavily toward connecting with others in its appeal. It's kind of spanned the range from providing structure to leaving a mark, but connecting with others has been sort of the core place where it's been all about. Part of the reason craft beer and liquor have been growing at beer's expense, in my mind, is they both skewed toward leaving a mark and fulfilling your potential, which were more relevant to millennials. I also believe that even though craft beer has historically skewed toward leaving a mark and fulfilling your potential, lately, I believe I've seen evidence that it's extending into connecting with others. It's sort of going back to beer's roots in that place. So if I'm right, if connecting with others is a core value for adult centennials as they grow into adulthood, this could be a good sign for beer in general, because beer has a natural appeal in that space. It's also a potential starting point for fatigued flagships. People have talked a lot about flagship fatigue. Well, here's an opportunity. Here's a new motivation that's on the rise in the culture. Is there an opportunity to take your flagship brand and use that as a starting point for an evolution of your positioning, not necessarily a repositioning? Again, brew pubs and tap rooms, we all know the numbers. We've seen the explosive growth in brew pubs and tap rooms. I suspect they're going to continue to flourish because these are the new third places. And who knows how many openings there'll be in the future. But this is a great place for connecting with others. And I think, again, that's going to be what it's all about for this generation. We might see that we've reached peak variety seeking. We did a study a few years ago where we talked to a bunch of millennial consumers about what are the reasons you like variety so much that you'd always try something different. And when you sort of map through the conversation, what you find out is that it reinforces their image of themselves as open-minded people, which in turn helps them grow and develop a sense of accomplishment. Well, as we've seen, or as I've speculated, that's going to be a little bit less relevant to Centennial adults than connecting with others. So maybe as they connect with others and gravitate back towards certain beer brands, a certain greater loyalty towards certain beer brands, we're going to see less of this rampant variety seeking that's out there, which I think might be a good thing for building brands again. And then this idea of creative rebellion. I've talked about this a lot in some of my other talks. Millennials are the first generation that don't see traditional rebellion as cool. They see creativity as cool. But they also talk about rebellion in different terms. They will talk about rebellion being cool, but when you have a deeper conversation, you realize they're not talking about traditional rebellion in terms of like a James Dean archetype. It's not about breaking the rules, smoking cigarettes, skipping school. It's about activist causes and things like that. Well, the reason for that is that traditional rebellion, the appeal of traditional rebellion, is driven by a sense of disempowerment. This sort of emphasis on creativity and creative rebellion that has drawn people to craft beer is driven by a sense of empowerment, but also a need to adapt. What we've seen in the Centennial experience, Lindsay talked about the empowerment that Centennials feel, also the fact that change is so important, the world is changing so much. So what we see is that the empowerment that millennials have felt, the need for adaptability that millennials have felt will only increase for Centennials. So this idea of creative rebellion is going to continue to grow and expand and be an important Centennial value. And that's good news for craft beer, because craft beer has been addressing this sort of need consciously or unconsciously for some time. And so that is my presentation. I know I buzzed through that quickly, but I wanted to save time for questions. So let's have some questions.
Thank you. Big round of applause for these folks. So certainly a lot to kind of pick through and unpack there, and I'll remind the audience, that if you guys have questions for Mike or Lindsay, send them up, and I'll be sure to ask them. But I just want to talk a little bit about sort of your first point, Lindsay, which was that this is going to really be the first, Centennials are really going to be the first generation that is a majority minority, which is a bit of a mouthful, but they're super diverse and they have a different set of core values, and obviously they move through the world completely differently than the generations before them. How do you expect, and Mike, you can answer this as well, how do you expect this will impact the types of products that they actually seek out in the alcohol space?
Yeah, I think there's going to be greater diversity reflected in the types of products that they're looking for as well. Even with millennials being kind of the most diverse generation that's currently in your market, we saw them really wanting to explore different types of fusion flavors and flavors from other cultures in the food and beverage category kind of more generally. And so I think we'll expect to see that some more. We already see in the market there's a lot of clustering of kind of small groups, smaller worlds that are driven by passion interests or other alignments of kind of their diversity, both of their cultural heritage, as we mentioned, but of their mindsets and their interests as well. And so I think you're going to see some greater alignment with products that they're going to really want something that connects with those passions that they have, or that is kind of a piece of their identity.
Are there products, obviously non-alcoholic products, or whether it's a clothing brand or anything else that they're currently engaging with? Are there companies that have really found success in marketing to this demographic already that brewers can maybe take some cues from or learn from based on how they've communicated their brands to this generation?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's quite a few different brands that have resonated with this generation. We see a brand like Under Armour did very well for a while with the Centennials. Their kind of Will What You Want campaign, I think. It empowered them and gave them that sense of individuality and that you do what you want. And they started, especially for women and young girls, starting connecting with not just the mainstream sports, expanding out to things like kickboxing and dance. So I think that looking at them and kind of some of what they've done in the past, they're struggling a bit right now, but that really resonated well with Centennials, that campaign in particular.
Sure. Mike, as you start to think about the transition that needs to occur, how rapid of a shift do you think some of the messaging around the products that are being created and delivered by brewers, how rapidly will they shift their communication to focus on Centennials and move it away from Millennials?
Well, historically, they have not responded quickly. And I've often joked, only half jokingly, that people just started figuring out Gen Xers, young Gen Xers. Gen Xers are turning 40, and Millennials are on the stage. So I think there's always some reluctance to shift that communication, that message, but I think it's going to happen more quickly this time. I think people recognize that people are more likely to recognize that generations are important now and that these differences do exist just because of their experience with Millennials.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about connecting with others as sort of a theme that these Centennials really adhere to or really aspire to be in terms of the brands that they associate with. And it seems like craft would actually really benefit from that. I know you had some slides that indicated maybe it was just starting to shift that way, but I think craft has really been about connecting with others the whole time.
Well, it's interesting because connecting with others is a core beer value, and I have maintained that almost any beer brand, just by the fact that it's a beer, has one foot in connecting with others. But whereas the other foot is really what differentiates it. And I think you're right. Beer in general has been in there, craft beer has been there, but there's also been that emphasis on leaving a mark or fulfilling your potential. I think it's going to sort of shift back where maybe both feet are in connecting with others, at least to a certain extent for some brands.
Right. Lindsay, how much of the sort of mobile and digital world that these consumers live in, how much is that going to shape what the future beer industry looks like? I mean, we heard from Drizzly, obviously, very bullish on the growth and expansion of e-commerce. But these Centennials are really used to doing everything on their mobile devices now. Do you expect them to do a lot of their purchasing of alcohol with their phones, and how big do you see that becoming?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a generation that came of age in mobile technology, so it's just an expectation that everything works via your mobile device. And so I think one of the things for us as older generations looking onto them is we still see this divide of online and on-premise or in-store purchasing. And so I don't think that they see that distinction as clearly. For them, it's very fluid, and so they're going to want to be able to engage with your brands in all sorts of ways. And so I definitely expect digital to grow and that them to be wanting to purchase products online, but at the same time, I think that doesn't mean that they won't value an in-store experience. And I think if there are heightened experiences that's part of walking into a store, that there's like a little bit something extra that is given, that will drive them into the store just as much as a flashy app might drive them to make online purchases.
Yeah, and obviously being so connected all of the time has been part of their upbringing. What else about the upbringing of this Centennial generation, this Gen Z demographic, do you think will change, I guess, or impact their willingness to trade up on products that have a higher price point? Because you also mentioned them being very pragmatic and practical. How do you see those two forces playing out over time?
So I think kind of price and quality are always the number one and two things we see any consumer of pretty much any age, any generation saying that is how they're evaluating products. But I think that's not necessarily where brands are able to differentiate themselves. It's in the experience with the brand and even the reflection of your own personal values in a brand that we see actually kind of shifting a purchase decision from a lower price item to something that might be more premium. So I think that brands that really have a strong purpose that reflects that of the Centennial generation, they're willing to pay more for that. I don't think we'll see them making price-only judgments. They're not necessarily frugal. They're smart. They're savvy.
Right. Mike, the beer industry is supposed to be fun. But these consumers, I don't know if I want to share a beer with a Centennial anytime soon. The way you guys made it seem.
Well, I do think the analogy with you always got to be careful when you're drawing analogies between generations. But you do see some parallels with the silent generation. There's a famous quote about that generation that when they were 20, they acted 40, and when they were 40, they acted 20. So I do think as they move into their 20s and 30s, they are going to start saying, wait a minute, why was I so repressed?
Yeah.
I need some fun in my life.
Yeah.
We're not seeing that yet, but I think that's going to happen.
So how would you suggest that breweries balance this notion of wanting to have all these really serious core values that they represent with still this idea that beer is supposed to be fun, that getting out to a third home or a third place is a place where these Centennials can kind of let loose a little bit, let their hair down?
Well, and that's exactly, I think, as I said, why brew pubs and tasting rooms are doing so well. And I think you hit the nail on the head. That's what's happening there. It's a place where they can engage with the brewery's values, which may be more serious, at least at some level, but still have fun doing it.
Yeah. So we got some audience questions here, and I know we're kind of butting up against the shot clock, but want to get a couple of these in. So one question that came in: if change is the sort of one constant that Centennials live by, how promiscuous do you think their alcohol beverage choices will be? I mean, clearly we're seeing consumers right now shifting across wine, beer, and spirits with ease. How do you think Centennials will shop?
I think because they perceive the world as changing so rapidly, adaptability is a core value for Centennials, and it really was for Millennials too. I think it's going to be even more so for Centennials, but that's about a need. I need to be adaptable because the world will change. That doesn't necessarily mean that they want to be adaptable, and I do believe there's a possibility that they're going to pull back on that variety seeking, because it doesn't really reinforce anything they want from life. It reinforces a need.
Yeah. In terms of messaging, Mike, which companies or which types of companies do you think are better positioned to market to Centennials? Larger, I would call them macro brewers, I guess, Anheuser-Busch with the Dilly Dilly campaign, or craft brewers like Anankazi that are really focusing on their core values and working with nonprofits and those types of initiatives.
I think any company that has a really good understanding of their own core values and does a good job of presenting those in a relevant way is going to be successful. And I think I do believe craft brands have been more willing to put a stake in the ground that way than the bigger brewers. I think bigger brewers sometimes feel like they have to be all things to all people. They understand the need to focus, but at the same time they're pulled toward a broader message. But I also see that getting better. So I think both are going to be in a good position to do that if they're willing to make the commitment.
Lindsay, do you think the larger companies could be in a better position to maybe just create a specific set of products that speak to Centennials and have maybe a different brand that is aimed at that demographic?
Not necessarily. I think since this is such a scrutinizing consumer, they're going to be doing a lot of research on any brand that they engage in. And so smaller brands actually in craft as a whole will have an advantage there because they have a very authentic message that they've been true to, whereas some larger brands tend to have lost their way or have such a large portfolio that there's multiple messages that are being conveyed in that. I think both have an opportunity to win with this generation, but I really do think it's going to be about focusing in on a purpose and making sure that you're kind of putting out there a brand that a Centennial would want to, get to know. And it's almost like creating this whole persona around it, and that's what they're going to be looking at and looking at, just what the company is doing for the world around them and for their community more specifically.
And I would add, when we use the word values, people tend to hear something that's more lofty and more serious, like donating to charitable causes or doing things for your community. But values can be things like leaving a mark. I would cite the current Coors Light campaign. I don't really know how effective it's been, but it's all about leaving a mark, that achievement orientation. It's really laser focused on that. So it's not just about what you're doing for your community and things like that in a serious way. It's saying, what do I value in terms of these four motivations?
Yeah. Mike, you work with a lot of craft brewers. You spent some time at this year's GABF. Are there any brands that come to mind that you think are really well positioned to market to this demographic? Any specific brands that stick out to you?
To this demographic, that's interesting.
And what is it about those brands, if you had to pick one or two?
Well, if I focus on what I said earlier about the sense of connecting with others, to your point, I think most craft brands do that to one extent or another. I don't necessarily see anybody who's really focused their message on that. It's sort of the subtext of almost everything most brands do. But most of the most successful craft brands are playing in that leave a mark or fulfill your potential space.
Gotcha. And Lindsay, final question for you. Do you have a sense on kind of what platforms these customers will expect to engage with brands on? Be it Snapchat or through text message or whatever it is. I mean, I was texting with a Lyft customer support something on the way here a couple days ago. So maybe I'm not in the right demo. Maybe I'll do that on Snapchat or something.
They're facile with text messaging and things like that. They see email as something that their parents use or even grandparents use. Facebook, same thing. It's kind of an obligation that you have to be on there to have a bit of a public presence. They gravitate towards more private channels, and they also will have multiple personas across all of these different social media platforms. So you might be marketing to the same individual, but portrayed very differently. So they might have a Fitstagram, an Instagram that's all about fitness, as kind of one element of one side, and then they might have their real Instagram that shows another profile that's very private and only their core friends are part of it. And so the messages they might expect when they're kind of in that Fitstagram fitness mindset are ones of being active and things like that, versus on their private networks, they might want something that's a little bit more intimate and a totally different message. So I think that's going to be another challenge in addition to just the different platforms working with things like Snapchat and Instagram, and probably newcomers that will continue to come into the space. But being able to really adapt to their different personas that they're portraying as well.
I'm just wrapping my head around Bitmojis, so I think I'm a little bit behind them. Thank you guys. Really appreciate the time and the insights. Cheers.
Thank you.